Welcome and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Water Connections webinar series. I'm your host, Richard Restuccia, and today we're going to be talking about what I think is a really important subject when it comes to drip irrigation. We're really like to promote the use of water efficient irrigation, and drip irrigation is a big part of that. But what I find often is that people take the position of, well, it's really hard to maintain. I hate fiddling with it. I always have challenges with the systems, and so it requires a lot more maintenance. Well, listen, today we're going to help you understand what maintenance you need to provide, how to work on your installation so that maybe you can reduce the amount of maintenance you have been giving it. And number three, really overall help you understand drip irrigation so that we can install more of it, so we can have more efficient irrigation, more water for everybody. And what's wrong with that? Well, helping us today is Eric Santos. Now, if you've been involved in irrigation anywhere in the last 30 years, this is a name you already know. Eric's been on the Irrigation Association Board of Directors. He does a lot of education outside at the community college level. And we worked together for many years at Valley Crest 8. And really, I learned more in that 8 years about irrigation from Eric than I had any other time in my life. He's really the most knowledgeable person I know in irrigation. But it's one thing to be knowledgeable. It's something else to really be able to convey concepts and ideas well. And that's where Eric really excels. Eric, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you on here. Man, you kept a lot of my promises to customers at Valley Crest when I said, we're going to save you water. You were the promise keeper that did that. So I always remember that when I talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard. We really had a great team. And looking back, we did some really phenomenal things. It really shows if you get the right team in place and everybody specializes in something different, the amazing things that a group can do. But Thank you for having me, and thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, you bet. And well, you're at Sperber Companies now, and you've got a lot of that great team back there. That's kind of exciting to see.
Yeah, it's really like the good old days. I mean, both you and I worked with Dave Hansen, and Dave Hansen, he's incredible. He's incredible. He's really been, funny, he's been in the industry longer than I've been alive. So sorry to embarrass Dave there, but he really has, he's probably done more for the irrigation world in the commercial space than I could ever dream about. And I still remember coming into the trade in the early 90s and picking up information that Dave had put together. And this is stuff that was late 80s, early 90s, that still very much holds true. So he was an irrigation advocate, a very, very strong advocate for irrigation efficiency back in the environmental care and the Valley Crest company that we worked for. And now he's with Sperber. And I know a lot of people have heard that Chad Sutton, who is another, there's just so many knowledgeable people within the world of irrigation. Sperber just has an incredible team, but there's Chad Sutton, who just joined as Director of Water Management. And the list really goes on and on. In the area of Northern California where I work, there's Paul Schultz, but you go up in the Northwest and they have irrigation experts. You go out to Florida, there's people like Alex Diaz, and then you go up to Boston, and then you have TJ Kendrigan, who was a Valley Crest guy that we used to work with as well. But just a really, really deep bench of irrigation experts who have just been doing this and really know the business.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed Dave Hansen working for him. And hey, talk about energy. That guy has it, had it then, still has it. It's really fun to work with him because of that.
Yeah, great leader. So it's great to work with a lot of those people again.
Yeah, well, good for you. That's interesting to hear about. Now, Eric, help us with this maintenance on drip systems. Why is it so important to have a good maintenance routine for drip irrigation systems?
Yeah, this is really a timely topic, Richard, because so just to give a little bit of background about myself. So I'm based in Northern California. And when I worked for Valley Crest, I supported the entire country as vice president of irrigation services. So I had an opportunity to travel from coast to coast, opportunity to work in markets like Las Vegas, where comparing Las Vegas to California, I think California is where Vegas was about 15 years ago. So very, very forward-thinking market. And at that point in time, the issues we're running to in California is everybody hated drip.
Yeah.
You go to Vegas and it's like drips everywhere, and people learn how to deal with it. They learn how to install it right. They learn how to manage it correctly. So what California is going through right now with the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, and then on top of that, there was this AB 1572, the ban of watering non-functional turf with potable water. We're really going to start to see a lot of, over the next 3-4 years, a lot of those turf areas being converted over to drip irrigation. So not just on the maintenance side, but on the install side, there's some pretty important factors. And my biggest fear is that a lot of these customers in California will just completely turn the water off. They'll just completely let the lawn go because they're not allowed to water it. But there are some pretty amazing landscapes that can be watered efficiently with drip if it's designed, installed, and maintained correctly. So as I say, one of the great things about drip is that you can't see it. It's invisible, it's underground. But one of the bad things about drip is you can't see it. It's invisible, it's underground. So it just makes things very, very challenging. I mean, typically you don't know it's not operating right until you see dead plants. And the automatic reaction for most contractors in the commercial space is to just go to that controller and bump up the time. So I tell people a lot of times, if you have a drip zone and you see plants start to yellow, don't automatically assume they're not getting enough water. Get out there and get a moisture probe and start probing, lift the plant out, see if it's hooked in, see if it's rooted. A lot of times you're expecting to pull out a dry root ball, but you pull out a plant that is just completely saturated. The soil's anaerobic, and you can just tell there's been no oxygen in there because we've overwatered it. The other way that we can, I mean, there's a couple different ways to stay on top to make sure drip's running properly. If we think there might be an issue with the drip zone, a lot of systems nowadays, because of MWELO, we're seeing master valves and flow sensors going in. And if it's a properly sized flow sensor, we can utilize that flow sensor to determine if the flow rate is accurate. But if you're on a project where you don't know what the flow rate was or what it was supposed to be during the install, and you turn on that valve and let's say it's running at 3 gallons a minute, you have no idea, is it supposed to be running at 5 gallons a minute, or is it supposed to be running at 1 or 2 gallons a minute? Assuming that you have a flow sensor that can read that flow. So if you can't utilize flow as a way to check, just to make sure you either don't have sections that are clogged or a big leak somewhere that's not servicing. The other way is just to take a pressure test. And I think it might have been Chris Loomis up at Santa Rosa. Chris Loomis is an IA instructor, but years ago, the Irrigation Association had a webinar. And Chris had profiled, it's just a little, it's a tip off the front of an air gun, a compressed air gun. And if you take that little tip and you put it right on the tip of a pressure gauge, it's a really good way to measure pressure from the beginning, the middle, and to the end of the zone. So that does tend to tell you a lot. You're looking for roughly a 10% change in pressure from the beginning to the end. You realize that you have a more significant drop in pressure than you have some other things going on. But those are just from a very high level. I just always tell people, avoid going to the controller and bumping up the time when you start to see a plant yellow out.
Yeah, what an interesting tip too about the tip to test that system. You just saved a bunch of us a lot of time.
Yeah, that's pretty, you know what? I went to my truck and I go, I'm gonna bring my gauge and show everybody, but I'm always giving those things away because I mean, at Harbor Freight, you can pick up the little rubber tip. It comes in a kit and it's like $5.
Yeah,
I'm always buying those things with a gauge. And whenever somebody says, hey, I'm really struggling with this drip zone, and we start looking at the zone, it's very, very common for a lot of contractors just to overextend and run the length of tubing over what it's designed to run. And no one ever looks at, okay, what's the emitter flow rate on this tubing and what's the spacing? And they just go, okay, I got this large area to cover. I got one valve. I'm going to do it all. And it goes in the ground. And then we find, hey, there's barely any water trickling out the end of it because we've lost all of our pressure. But meanwhile, on the front end, everything's flooding out. So, but again, here's another example. The instant reaction is I'm just going to go over and crank up the time.
yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if it was Chris. I never had the conversation with her, but definitely give her props because I believe it was Chris. Hopefully I get this right. And this might have been a couple of years ago, so relatively new way to measure flow rate out of a drip emitter.
Yeah. So, Eric, how important is it to do visual inspections? I mean, what do you recommend? Weekly, monthly, in season, out of season? Is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm a big advocate of, and this is coming from somebody who was a maintenance account manager at one point in my career. You got to walk your site on a weekly basis during the peak season because, I mean, things turn really, really fast. If you're in a market, let's say you're in Colorado or Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the high desert, you don't have a whole lot of time to waste. So when things start turning on you, you really should be walking outside of the peak season, or maybe you're in an area where it isn't as dry or as arid, then maybe walk it every other week. You might do one of these things where you walk your project, walk half of it one week and then walk the other half the next week. So you're always there. And you really can just by walking around and looking. And I mean, you could carry a moisture probe. I like to just carry a really long screwdriver. And if things look odd, I just start poking the soil with the screwdriver, and that'll tell you if there's any moisture in the ground. But I always tell people, if things don't look right to you, you want to turn on the valve. The last thing you do is don't go to the controller. Make sure you turn it on by the controller so physically you can see it coming on. But aside from those walks, ideally you want to be doing monthly wet checks. And I know there's a lot of pushback around that, and there's a lot of commercial customers that think, well, if I include all 100% of irrigation maintenance into my maintenance cost, I'm going to get a better deal. But what tends to happen in those situations is we find that contractors will start to skimp on those monthly inspections that they're supposed to be doing because, yeah, hey, they're trying to make money and it's a competitive market and they were probably low bid and that's why they got the contract. So I just tell customers, you know, these in-contract repairs where irrigation's all inclusive, it never ends well. It doesn't end well for the customer. It doesn't end well for the contractor. But in those situations, I strongly recommend doing those monthly checks, but documenting those. And that was one thing that I really admired back at Valley Crest is we were very, very diligent about doing the monthly inspections and documenting those. So you could open up the file cabinet, and this is going way back before we digitized everything, but you could open up that file cabinet and go back month after month and see what was inspected and what was repaired and what the deficiencies were. Nowadays with flow sensing's really come a long way in the past 5 years, and thankfully, because as drip is becoming or was becoming more and more popular, it's pretty popular now in the West. I think people have finally gotten over the idea of that it doesn't work. It does work, but the flow sensors that we were using were the old paddle style flow sensors. And now with the innovation of ultrasonic flow sensing, where we can get really, really low, depending on the size of the line, you may be able to get below 1 gallon per minute flow reading. So that's really, really accurate. And when you have drip zones that are running 3, 5, maybe 6 gallons a minute, utilizing flow sensing becomes really important. And then if you add, hopefully, if you're using flow sensing, you're utilizing a smart controller with two-way connectivity. It always it's very frustrating when I see flow sensing on a controller that doesn't have two-way communication. Maybe the customer didn't want to pay for the subscription, but the controller is reacting, and the only way somebody knows that there's been an issue with a drip zone is they physically have to walk up to the controller, open up the door, and look at the flow alarms. So with technology nowadays, cloud-based controllers, we've really, really come a long way.
Yeah, so true, right? And this ability to not only identify flow being high or low, and shutting off is a big water saver and money saver for the customers. So the other thing I wanted to mention too is maybe 5 years ago we saw maybe only 15% of our smart controller installs with flow sensors, and I think it's up to 30% now. I mean, there's been a big increase in people using that. It's a lot of reasons for that, but it's I think it's really key. I mean, I imagine you've not designed a system in recent memory without one on.
Yeah, and still today, I'd probably say over 50% of the sites that I do come across, flow's turned off.
Yeah,
Gosh, what are we doing here? It's like we spent all this money to put this in, and then, but it just, unfortunately, there's still a lot of people that are like, oh, that thing, it's always throwing false alarms and shutting down, so I turned it off. It's like, well, maybe you didn't have the right K factor or offset, and for whatever reason or another, it wasn't measuring right. Or the other thing is maybe the thresholds are too tight. The one that really always blows my mind is specifically like on a drip zone that has a 2 gallon per minute expected flow rate. And
right.
somebody sets their flow threshold to 20%. 20% of 2 gallons a minute. I mean, that's 2.2. It's going to trigger like immediately.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why they're getting false alarms. So, there definitely is a learning curve, and I think each year our industry gets better and better. But I really do think it's manufacturers that are really pushing us, and then now we have legislation coming in. But I've always felt like manufacturers are way ahead of the curve, and just contractors. It's kind of generational, where, I mean, you have these new kids that are coming out of college and everybody's got a phone and everybody's used to just using their phone to get flow alarms, to review status of their controller. So just that younger generation is very, very adaptive and very open to technology. And I think sometimes the older guys like myself that have been doing this for 30 years just kind of get stuck in their old habits.
Yeah, that's true. Habits are they really do kick in, right? A lot. So you recommend so walking the system. This is going to help you spot issues, right? And so what about fixing these issues you spot? Any things that you keep in your truck so that you know that you always have inventory on hand to fix what the common fixes are? Can you help our audience with that, please?
That's a really good question, because I do see a lot of repairs done incorrectly. And then this gets back to repair techs. Not having the right fitting and knowing the difference between when do I use a barbed fitting or when do I use a compression fitting. Well, now there's lock style PVC fittings, which are kind of a pain in the butt to use. But when you're going into that situation, you don't know what kind of tube. Is it 17 millimeter? Is it 1/2 inch? So that really has been kind of a way to just standardize the kind of fittings that we keep, as opposed to trying to keep both barbed and compression. And then drip tubing is, oh my gosh, Richard, this is a major hot button with me. So when we go to do repairs, typically the tech will just grab whatever's on the shelf in their stock room, or they'll go to the store and just grab whatever the shelf, and they just think, hey, an emitter's an emitter, or drip tubing, it puts out water.
It's
Doesn't
all
matter.
half inch.
Yeah, it's all half inch. So I tell people, yeah, if you're dealing with point source drip, it's a little bit easier to tell what the flow rate is on point source drip. Hopefully you can figure out what manufacturer, but typically when it comes to drip products, most products are pretty much common within a certain area. So people are used to seeing a certain brand of emitter and they can tell what the flow rate is. Drip tubing, on the other hand, some of the older drip tubing is really tough. So if you have an inline drip tube that gets torn out of the ground, knowing what the flow rate was, it's easy to figure out the emitter spacing and what the row spacing. But this was something I learned from Jim Borneman at Ewing a long time ago. And I still use this, but you take a 2-inch slip cap, and I just keep that in my truck, and I use that to measure the flow rate out of an emitter. So I time it with my phone, and then I pour that water into a measuring cup, and then I do the conversion to figure out what the gallons per hour are out of that. But yeah, gosh, we see that all the time where it's just drip is drip. It puts out water. So when they go to do that repair, unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of thought put into, am I putting the right stuff in? Yeah, really important.
Yeah, no, that's a good tip. And then, sometimes you do get failures. It happens. Are there things that you can put in your system besides flow sensing that would identify a problem so that the way you find it isn't from dead plant material?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of making sure that systems are fed from both sides. So I know some contractors will just come off their valve and they'll just snake the tube all the way through from one end to the other. But I'm a big fan of having a header and a footer, so lines are being fed in. So if a line's ever cut, it flushes from both sides. And then having a flush at the end, and then having making sure you're using air relief valves. So yeah, well, drip tubing's come a long way. We have drip tubing with check valves in it now, but if you're on a slope and you don't have check valves, making sure you use an air vacuum relief and making sure that's placed at the highest point. Another big thing that I'm an advocate of are indicators. And then using multiple indicators. If it's a really large zone, I like to see indicators on the ends of both, the far ends of both zones. So let's say my valve is in the middle and then it splits off. As many indicators as I can have, which will just tell me where that zone actually ends, is a huge help from a maintenance perspective. So on the maintenance side, filters should probably be flushed. I know there's some filters that have indicators, which are really nice. There was a manufacturer that I think they were beta testing a filter that actually had a flow meter on the top of it. But I don't think that really ever took off. I thought that was a really cool idea. When it comes to the drip filters, flushing those out at least once a year, just depending. I've been on sites that have never been flushed and the filters are crystal clear, and then others where you have to flush them every 6 months. But the filters that have the indicator, and I know this is going back, but a lot of designers used to have a pressure gauge installed before the filter and a pressure gauge installed after, and that would be our way of telling the differences. And then the flush at the far end, I mean, you can have an auto flush or just a manual flush. I'm fine either way, as long as the flush can be found. That's the other thing, is sometimes the flush valves don't get put in boxes. they just get buried, and then you're out there trying to figure out, well, where's the end of the system? Does it even have a flush? And there's just so many things, little details on, I'm going to say on the install side, because a lot of times these are great designs, but when it comes to the install, the contractor tends to cut corners. Yeah, Richard, I apologize. My battery is
working down.
yeah.
While you're doing that, I just want to mention to everybody, we do have the Q&A open. So if you've got some questions for Eric, put them in there, and I'll get those to him as we're going. And last week I tried something new, and I was giving away some hose end timers for people who ask good questions. And these actually are using real-time ET data to calculate how much irrigation should be run. So I'll be giving a few of those away too for some good questions. So anyway, we're back on, Eric.
So Richard, I brought the wrong charger. I'm using a different laptop for this. So you might have me for 30 seconds here, so it might be a short call.
Okay. Well, we already got a call. Oh, we already got a question.
Right.
And somebody's asking about a moisture meter that you can recommend. You mentioned the screwdriver, a moisture meter. Is there a good moisture meter?
Yeah, the moisture meter I like to use is a Spectrum Technologies. It's a 350 TDR Spectrum Technologies. Blue Lab also makes, it's more economical. It's a handheld. It's not as accurate as the Spectrum Technologies TDR 350, but yeah, I'm a big fan of the TDR 350.
So I know some are pretty short and others, maybe 18 inches. Does that matter?
Yeah, it does matter. So with the Spectrum Technologies, it comes with different length probes. So it definitely matters. So hopefully as a water manager, you're managing, your root depth, and then you have a management allowable depletion that you're scheduling to, but all things that a smart controller does for you. So back before smart controllers, we had to do all the math manually. So now it's a lot easier.
So we've got another question coming in, and somebody is asking, at what slope percentage do you recommend drip tubing with a check valve? Is there a certain point in which you say, yeah, if it's more than 2, 5, whatever it is, percent, you should have a check valve?
Yeah, I think, well, if there's any slope, I always opt for the check valve, even if it's a 1% slope. I just, from a long-term standpoint, I'm a big advocate of always using check valves if there's any slight slope. And then in terms of the amount of water that the check valve will actually hold, that'll vary by the manufacturer. There's some that will hold 15 feet of head. So, but gosh, Richard, I'm really hoping my battery doesn't die here. So I apologize.
We're going to keep you on as long as possible. And when you're done, we're done. So when the battery's done, we're done. But some people have a pet number as far as how many gallons per minute they want their emitter line. What some like it a half, some like 1, 2. Do you have a certain number that you like and a reason why for that?
Yeah, that is another great question that I forgot to talk about. So I always tell people, well, when I say people, I always tell contractors that are doing a turf conversion, like, don't automatically assume your soil type, because I've been in these situations where I ask somebody, okay, what's your soil type? And they go, oh, we have a clay loam. And I go, okay, well, let's double check. So either take your soil, send it off to a lab, or do the touch field method and a jar test. But at a minimum, do a jar test. Don't automatically assume, because I've been in those situations where we say it's clay loam and you find out it's sandy loam. So I think like 9 out of 10 contractors, and that's just anecdotal, but 9 out of 10 contractors that I work with prefer, if they're using inline drip, 0.9 GPH on a 12 by 12 spacing, regardless of what the soil type is. So I was at a project last week, and they go, hey, we have an issue. Like, we run this drip valve for like 3 minutes and the water starts to run off. And I just go, okay, I mean, remember we talked about the soil type? And they go, yeah, well, we checked the soil over here, but we don't have that issue. We have that issue over here. And yeah, completely different soil, same project, but just different soil up on the other side of the house, where come to find out it was a clay loam, and they went with a 0.9 on the 12 by 12 spacing. And sure enough, like after 3 minutes, people don't think that you can have runoff with drip, but yeah, it's easy to have happen.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So it's more than just an easy question. You really have to take a look at that soil and determine from that.
Yeah, I mean, the only time that we should be using 0.9 on a 12 by 12 is if we have like a sandy loam, because a 0.9 on a 12 by 12, that is pretty close to the precip of like a spray head. And I ask people, I go, how long do you run your drip zone for? And they go 30 minutes. That's always the answer, 30 minutes. And I go, okay, like, what's your precip rate? And they go, why does that matter? And I'm go, well, like you wouldn't run a spray zone for 30 minutes, right? And they go, no, absolutely not. I go, okay, well, your 0.9 on your 12 by 12 spacing is putting down close to the same amount, 1.44 inches per hour. And I have that memorized because I see it so often.
Yeah.
And contractors just think, hey, I need to put in the tubing close on that 12 by 12, and I need to put down a lot of water quickly. And, you know, which is okay if you're doing a cycle and soak, or if you're programming that correctly into the controller. But typically, I think most contractors, when they're programming a smart controller, don't even think twice about, well, what's my emitter flow rate and what's the emitter spacing? And just like the soil type too, that's another thing that people just automatically say, no, it's a loam. Yeah, it's close enough. But and then if it's anything that's clay, then 0.6 on a 18 by 18. And a lot of times people are like, oh, 18 inches, that's way too far apart. But when you're dealing with inline drip, I just try to explain that we're using the soil to get that water to move. And when we have clay, it's going to tend to move laterally. It's not going to move down. So the other habit that is hard to break, which leads to, and I was going to show some of these slides, is within an inline drip zone, you might have one section with 2 rows that might be like 8 inches apart. And then you look at the next row and it's like 14 inches apart. And typically you see that happen when the drip tubing goes in after the plants. And there's no contractor out there that likes to put the tubing in before the plants go in. But ideally, if you want to make sure that you have very uniform coverage, put your inline drip tubing first, and then you put your plants in. So
yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to ask you, you know, have you seen many successful drip tubing for turf installations?
Yeah, I have. You know, I used to be a big skeptic. And there's some big projects down in Southern California. And these are projects that typically somebody took the time to do the soil prep right. So I would say that's the one caveat. If you want it to be successful, you have to do the right soil prep. But even in those situations where you do have a standard turf and you come in and you put the drip tubing after, you'll start to see streaks where you trenched and where you put it in. But some of the projects with some of the jobs I was talking about earlier down in the Beverly Hills area, just really amazed with the appearance of the turf that is irrigated with subsurface. It's pretty amazing. So I know it can be done, but the prep has to be done right.
Yeah. So, and that's really a great point, right? I mean, it does take some extra work, but it definitely can work, and turf looks good. So we have somebody else asking about 12 millimeter or 17 millimeter drip in your area. So 12 or 15, or why would you use one or the other?
And I am in love with 12 millimeter.
Are you?
Well, 12 millimeter on a 6-inch spacing. So this goes back to the point where contractors like to put down water fast because it gets to the plants. And that's the thing with, if you go with 12 millimeter tubing, you'll probably have to special order it, but I think it's a lot easier to work with. It comes in 6-inch spacings. As long as you manage it right, because you do put down a lot of water in a very, very short period of time. And there was the guy that really turned me on. I know he's pretty well known. Scott Sommerfeld used to be an irrigation designer, worked for East Bay Mud for a really long time. Scott is retired now, but he still shows up to the IA shows. But yeah, he was the guy that really opened my mind. I always thought, oh, hey, that 12 millimeter stuff, nobody uses that. But yeah, he was the one that really, yeah, got me thinking. So I'm definitely a fan of 12 millimeter. I just wish more places carried it, and you have to special order it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fairly interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because yeah, it does make sense when you say that. And I haven't installed much 12, but certainly an option. So we'll check that out. Somebody else is asking about if you have a line source. I'm assuming they mean a drip line, emitter line with the check valve. How do you feel about punching in a micro spray? And if you do, what should you do to compensate for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was hoping nobody would ask that question because there was a term that I picked on a couple years back, and it's a term that came from the ag side. So I was at the IA show, and one of the projects that was being profiled in the general session. Oh, hey, Richard, before I forget, let me just take the time to encourage everybody on the call to attend the IA show. Definitely, if you're on the West Coast, it's in Long Beach, November 4th. The show actually is November 6th through the 7th. But all right, so I digress. The term was variable rate irrigation. And it was basically using different emission devices within the same zone to apply the proper amount of water. So I'll just take point source, for example. You might have a point source valve where you might have one plant that has one emitter, and then a larger plant might have two emitters. And then on that same valve, you have a 15-gallon plant. So you have different flow rates, but then the precip rates are all relatively the same. My stance, and this is something that people argue over like crazy. They'll say, no, you can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. And I go, well, who says you can't punch in something where you need extra water? And the reason I say it's okay to do this, because I've seen too many other times the alternative that happens. The alternative is there's a really small section of plants that are stressing out. And what does a person...
You're there.
All right. I got somebody's blowing up my phone here. All right. Okay. But the alternative is somebody will just go to the controller just because there's this really small section within the zone that's drying out. Well, what happens is everything else within that zone gets overwatered. So as much as people dislike, I am okay with you punching something in as long as you're keeping in mind and just being aware of what your precip rate is that you're putting water down in that area.
Yeah, I really like that. Right? So many people talk about hydrozone. You have to hydrozone. You have to hydrozone. Well, how many properties am I on that I never got to I didn't do the planting. Yeah. I'm having to do the irrigation for what's already there, and maybe that's when I have to use that technique.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In the ideal world where it's designed right, well, it's always designed right. I typically find, but maybe not installed right, or those situations where the plants went in and then the drip tubing was thrown in, and the drip tube, typical contractor will run the drip tubing as close as they can to the root ball, and then they find out, well, here's this whole other section that's dry. But yeah, and then people say, well, no, you can't do that. And it's like, okay, well, who says you can? Like, is there a law against punching in a point source emitter into an inline drip tubing? So it's, you know, as much as I don't like to see modifications like that made, I do think if you consider the alternative, it's doing that is better than overwatering the entire zone because you have one small section that needs extra water.
Yeah. So, okay, good. Yeah. So then somebody else is asking about 0.9 and sandy soil as opposed to a 0.6 or 0.4. What's the advantage there?
Yeah, 0.9 is kind of a must because in that sandy soil, the water just the pattern, if you look at the profile, kind of starts at the top and then it's almost like a column and then it goes down. So you get very little movement. So yeah, you want to put down that water, try to put it down quick, and then hopefully have those. And this is where you were talking about the 12 millimeter. So again, I learned this from Scott Sommerfeld. So where I live, my house backs up to a creek. And I used to have 0.9 on 12 by 12 spacings. And my soil, I might have maybe 4 inches of decent soil, but everything below that, it's pretty much a quarry. So for me, going with the 12 millimeter on a 6-inch spacing with a very high flow rate emitter, it was like a game changer. It was like, oh, I didn't have to water. I didn't have to overwater because I was trying to get that water to move out laterally with the 12-inch spacing on the emitters. The 6-inch spacing just really helped that out quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Now, you mentioned the IA show in November. We'll both be there in just a little bit over a month. Are you teaching any classes there this year?
No, you know what, Richard? I get that question a lot. I am not an instructor, and it's something that I have the application sitting on my desk. But it's for me, gosh, I spend so much, I'm learning every day. So I hold super high regards for the people that teach for the IA. Some of the best instructors in the industry. In the classes you take at the irrigation industry, I on the landscape side, I hold every IA certification, and pretty much things have changed a lot with IA education. Back when I started becoming certified, there weren't these kind of paths or recommended reading materials to study for an exam. So you kind of just took every class that was out there. And the IA instructors, there's guys like, I don't want to leave anybody out, but Craig Borland, Don Franklin, Chris Pine, Kurt Thompson. I mean, these are guys that just really taught me so much within my career. And it was going to the IA show to get that education that really helped me obtain those certifications. So, but yeah, there's always just so much going on, from the little breakout sessions on the show floor. And people say, well, you don't need to go to the IA show every year because, there aren't so many new products. And then I think about that and I go, gosh, every year I go and I leave there thinking I'm so thankful that I went, because I went to this one session that I learned about. It was drawing a blank on the name of the company. There was a company last year that had this device. They called it a water conditioner. So as water's flowing through the water conditioner, which is full of magnets, it makes the water softer. But I had a client that asked me about that 2 weeks ago. And if I didn't go to the IA show and sit in on that presentation, I would have had no idea how it worked. So, but there's always new products. That new product contest is a great place to check out new things. And it just, the floor, there's so much. I wish there was more time, because it really, it's hard to get through the whole show in the time that it's open.
Yeah, no, you're right. And over the years, it's been a great place to pick up knowledge on products, applications, how-tos, troubleshooting. I mean, there's really a lot of classes offered, and I hope everybody heard when you said I learn stuff every day. I mean, that's great that you're a lifelong learner, and there's still stuff to learn after 30 plus years.
Oh, and you know what, Richard, your webinars, I mean, huge value to the green industry. So thank you so much for putting these on.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, Eric. And gosh, thank you for coming on. You're always learn stuff from you every time I talk to you. So I really appreciate it, and getting this information out to the public. As I was saying earlier, we all our webinars are at hydrorain.com/webinars. You can see all the recordings there, or on the Husqvarna Water YouTube channel. You can watch them there as well. We extract the audio and we create podcasts from these. So wherever you get your favorite podcasts, look for the Water Connections, and you'll find us there too. I'm always inspired by the people that are out there working and learning at the same time. I think that's really great, and I know a lot of you do that. So thank you for doing that. And Eric, thank you. Really appreciate all this information. It's going to make my afternoon and upcoming weeks easier. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, sorry about the power cord. It's just a bonehead maneuver on my part, but yeah, if I didn't get to show my slides, but if anybody would like to get a hold of me, you can find me on LinkedIn, or my email address is E Santos, that's ESANTOS at SperberCompanies.com, or my cell number is 925-505-1234. It's pretty easy to remember. So
yeah, I don't know how you got that one, but that is easy. And I did mention to everybody, when we send the video out this afternoon to everybody, we'll include that contact information as well.
thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Eric. I look forward to seeing you out there, and seeing you at the IA show here in a month.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thanks. Bye now.
Bye-bye.